cyber risk is a top priority for our members and for the regulatory and supervisory community. What's interesting is that the debate has moved from you have to protect yourself to assume you're going to be attacked. What do you do next? How do you stay resilient? How do you protect yourself? So our members and the regulatory and supervisory community are looking at how can we safeguard institutions that way. So I wanted to start with John and ask you, in your practice at PwC, and also as a former FBI expert on cybersecurity, how do you view the current threat landscape? Where do you see the issues, and where do you see them going forward?
Sure. And the question, I'll tell you, I get that question a lot. What's the threat like? Is it real? Because we always talk about, there are two types of firms out there, those who have been breached and those who just don't know it yet. And sometimes we get a little eye roll on that, but it's the truth. The threat's real and it's constant, and it seems to be picking up. In the old days, we used to basically put the threat coming from 5 buckets: hacktivists, criminal groups, nation states, cyber terrorism, and war. What I see in the last few years, there's been a real change. For example, hacktivists, like, for example, Anonymous, LulzSec, they're nuisance groups, and they don't really exist so much anymore. So they're no longer a risk to companies. But there's been a real blending between criminal groups and nation-state actors. For example, North Korea, you're probably familiar, even as a nation-state actor, ones who are responsible for the attack on SWIFT, going after the Bank of Bangladesh. In January of this year, they were associated with attack on the Bank of Chile, which attacked their ATM systems and took $10 million. And they are associated with the Ryuk ransomware, which is a particularly vicious type of ransomware that's out there and is causing quite a bit of problems, which coincidentally, the early days of ransomware, the first ransom, for example, was 2 pizzas. Just last week, in response to a Ryuk ransom, 2 pizzas. It's hard to send it through email. But the
2 Bitcoin. 2 Bitcoin.
Yeah, right. But last week I was dealing with a client who had Ryuk ransomware, and the demand was $11 million.
Yeah.
So it's really picking up. Ponymon just did a survey and described that 25% of all cyber attacks are aimed against the financial sector, which is more than any other industry. So obviously, there's a push. I will tell you the silver lining in that, because I'm an optimist, is that the financial services industry is generally ahead of everyone else in their preparedness and resiliency, because they've been through, baptized by fire. Where do I see this thing going? I'll tell you that crooks are typically early adopters of a technology. They're always on the leading edge. So as IoT becomes more and more prevalent, connected devices, smart devices, they're already there. And they're ahead of security firms, they're ahead of regulators. So we're seeing lots more attacks that way. Ransomware continues to be an issue and continues to become more complicated and more directed. And again, the ransom goes up. And then finally, I see there's a real crowdsourcing of attacks now.
Yeah.
So the bad guys used to all be individuals, but now they're actually, for example, Cisco just identified 74 groups on Facebook that are dedicated to attacking the financial sector. So they come out of the dark and into the light, and they're crowdsourcing their knowledge. And again, that's the way they're staying ahead of us. So that's as it is today. So again, the threat is real. Everybody turn off your computer.
So when you're talking to your clients, what's the best advice that you can give? I mean, in a nutshell, what's the most important thing they should be looking at?
The basics.
Yeah.
It is surprising to me, both in my time in the Bureau and in my time as in PwC, when we come out to even large corporations, Fortune 10s, for example, they haven't done their basic network hygiene.
Yeah.
Passwords, backups, and things like that. They've been successful almost in spite of themselves. There's a little bit of the ostrich head in the sand mentality. And so, yeah, we'd really just pay attention to the basics.
Great, thank you. Art, representing the public sector, you are not only a director at the Federal Reserve Bank, but you're also chairing the Basel Committee's work on operational resilience. So you have you have both hats. And I was wondering, how are you viewing this new move into resilience? What are sort of the key issues for you there?
Thanks, Martin. You started out by saying it's bigger. It used to be cyber, now it's operational resilience. That was point number 1. I mean, cybersecurity is still very important, but it shouldn't be taken out of context of the broader spectrum of things that could call an operational disruption. So from the committee's perspective and from what we're doing domestically, we broaden that kind of to encompass all types of hazards that could affect the operations of a firm. Now, when we started to focus on that, one of the things we thought about is it has to be firm-specific, but firms connect to a broader ecosystem. And somehow we have to communicate the role of the firm in terms of its criticality to that ecosystem and design our response to address both those factors, the firm and the ecosystem overall, which has taken us down a path that even though, and I appreciate John saying this, the financial services sector is ahead of most of the other sectors in terms of preparedness. That doesn't make us A, immune to the types of disruptions that those other sectors are experiencing, and B, we need to be knit with those other sectors. So Ann and I were talking before this session, if we just focused on the financial services sector, we might get it all right in terms of operational resilience. But if a power outage occurs, guess what? You're not as resilient as you thought. So we have to connect a lot of the dots, and that's what we've been talking about more broadly, how we can bring more players to the table in an organized fashion and have a collaborative, if you will, and coordinated response. So that's a lot of what the discussion is. How we do that, we won't do it by regulations that are designed only for, if you will, financial services firms. And regulations themselves tend to be backwards looking, right? So we have to be a lot more agile. So we're talking about ways to do all of those things. Maybe more principles and risk-based approaches rather than stodgy, traditional regs that say thou shalt do this. So this new order is what we've kind of worked through. I think of it as, I said new order, sometimes I refer to it as the new frontier, the idea that we need to do things differently because the threat landscape has changed and the operational environment has changed and evolved. So to start, we've been talking about some basic things we could do, some principles around what I call impact and outcome, all right? Impact is, you can, as Martin says, it used to be, well, I may not be hacked. And as John has already said, you've probably already been hacked. And if you don't know that, fine. So get used to the idea of you're going to be hacked. All right, what do you do about that? How do you get an outcome that's more resilient than what you had previously? Whether or not that's you've already planned for those sorts of things, whether or not you're always in a continuous learning mode, and you have to make some capital investments in most of these cases that are going to be driven by that. So there's a lot there, and what we're trying to do is direct the dialogue around those key elements. Can't get all your systems, so maybe we do critical first. In those critical systems, maybe we look at certain functions. The resiliency of certain functions may be higher than others. So there's a myriad of things that we're toying with, but the idea of putting them in a cohesive set of principles or framework, and then sharing them more collaboratively in a way that you can impact the dialogue before we put something out. So the public sector is ready to listen and work with the private sector.
Great. And you also mentioned the importance, of course, of the interconnectivity issues and the third-party vendors, and so there's a lot of questions there. Anne, maybe I can ask you, what is HSBC doing at the moment differently around cyber resilience than it might have been a few years ago? And as you are active in many jurisdictions where they are coming out with, ideas, discussion papers in terms of what the industry should be considering, how are you sort of knitting together all those approaches?
Painful. So what we've started to do is that we've actually taken the 6 related, resilience risk-related functions and brought them under one. So we've established an overall resilience risk organization within HSBC. And what we brought together was the old information security risk, our systems and data transaction processing, our third-party risk, business continuity and incident management, and protective security. We brought them under one umbrella because they all touch on resilience risk. We have, luckily, when we talk about how are we dealing with the regulators, we actually brought one of the regulators on board, Professor Buck Rogers, as he likes to be known, from the Bank of England, has joined HSBC, and he's instrumental in establishing this organization company. Key things that we've picked up on from what John had said, right? Organizations today, years ago, I've been in information security for 22 years, and it always was if you get hacked, if it happens. You can no longer use the word if, it's when.
Right.
Or it already happened, right? So the key things that organizations have to be ready, have to be in a position to do is detect it, find it, stop it, and then recover quickly from it. And as Art said, our full goal of resilience risk is really to focus on the impacts and the outcomes. We need to be able to ensure that we as an organization are ready to come back from anything that occurs. From a business perspective, we've asked our businesses to go out to look at what's important to them. If they woke up tomorrow morning, what's a bad day? And what's a really bad day? So right now, we've taken, I think it's 100, close to 190 of those critical processes, critical functions, and they represent about 52% of our P&L. And we've done process maps for each of those. And we've broken it down bit by bit to understand what are the controls that we have in place along those process maps. Are those controls effective? What else needs to be done? Identify any gaps and implement the right tools, technologies, the people, whatever else you need to do to strengthen that.
Great, thank you. Marlena, we've been working together on a survey where we've been asking a lot of our large members how they are approaching cyber resilience. And I was wondering, as you hear Anne's answer also, what are some of the trends that you're seeing in the industry?
Yeah, sure. So as Martin alluded to, as Martin alluded to, the IAF and McKinsey has been collaborating on a survey with a range of global financial institutions, and we've got some preliminary results that we're actually discussing later at the work session as well, right? Just to pick up on a few threads that we're hearing here, I think number one is, in general, the maturity of the financial sector is quite high, and that is correlated by the size of the institution, not surprisingly. So that's the first one. The second is, when we look within the financial institutions and across the dimensions of cyber practices, we find quite high maturity scores when it comes to identify as well as governance, quite high in terms of protect as well, which is unsurprising because most people have actually spent a lot of time on network infrastructure, technical controls, right? On the other end, actually find lower scores when it comes to recovery, and so I think that's where the focus is moving towards, as well as supply chain dependency management, right? And I think that actually links to what we've been speaking about in terms of, hey, the world isn't just about my firm, the world is actually about the ecosystem around my firm. Other firms, whether they are peers, competitive, but also vendors, suppliers, etc. Right? So that's the second point. And then the third point I would say is very related to the conversation, Art, that you were just saying, right, is I think there's more of a shift now towards let's get the basic hygiene and then let's figure out how do we take a risk-based approach to putting additional controls, additional detection, additional recovery capabilities on certain assets compared to others, right? You clearly need the basic foundation, completely agree, John, but then you've done the basic foundation for the more sophisticated firms, how do we appropriately balance where we actually want to protect?
Yeah. So what are the more robust practices you think that are lacking in the financial sector or that could be improved? Are there practices that you identified where you think?
Yeah, so there are a couple of pieces here. I would say in general, and just going back to the theme of identify as well as governance, right? Most firms now have their inventory of assets. They've got some way of tiering it to figure out where to prioritize. Yeah. The next step is actually the extent to which that's been syndicated and more so, you've brought in the input of the business, right? So making sure this is not just the view of technology as well as the risk function, but the business and everyone as a firm actually stacks hands to say, if we had an additional dollar, here's what we actually want to protect. So that's actually one piece. The second piece is when we look at the protect dimension, right? Obviously, there is a range of things that people are doing in terms of patching updates, in terms of scanning the environment. There's still a little bit more to be done, especially on the more critical assets in terms of the regularity of the scanning, in terms of making sure the patches are truly update, right? Which I would put under the basic hygiene component, right? And so that feels like something that could be done a bit more. And then the third is back to my theme on dependency management, right? Just truly understanding who are our vendors, how are they plugged into our network? Have we appropriately risk tiered them? Is the security team involved in the actual proposals as well as the RFPs as you go out to new vendors? Are you doing on a regular basis security assessments as well as audits, right? Yeah. Those are some of the practices on the third-party dependency management.
Thank you.
Just to comment on something you said, Marlena, about the supply chain. Totally agree that we have to look at the outside, our third parties, our fourth parties, everything else. But we also need to remember about our internal dependencies
Yeah.
because we become so complacent that, well, it's always going to be there. It's always happening.
Yeah.
And we got to make sure that we're looking at the internal dependencies as part of that supply chain, particularly when we talk about resilience, right? External is key, I get it, but we're too complacent with what goes on within the organizations.
And I think that's part of, because I was going to say the same thing. When we're talking about security protection, just as human nature, we tend to look outside.
Yep.
So we tend to look at, hey, everybody else and how do they impact me without taking care of our own house. So it really is, one of the things I've heard thus far, which is great, is cyber is essentially an evolutionary process. Mm-hmm. We're all starting to evolve, and so now we're looking at it's just a risk. You know, it used to be a scary, cyber was its own thing. Mm. But now I'm starting to see, particularly in the financial industry, that they're just considering it a risk holistically, and how do we deal with it?
Yeah.
But it is internal as well as external, and I think that's the real impact.
Yeah, yeah. I want to bring Lori into it. Working at an insurance firm which also underwrites cyber risk for your clients, you're obviously looking at this from many different vantage points. And I was wondering, in the risk management space, how are you looking at resilience, and are there new tools that you're employing that are helping with this?
Yeah, there were definitely new tools that we are looking at to help us on the underwriting side. And you know, we are sort of uniquely positioned because we are an insurance company. We do have our own risk and resilience that we have to look at from a perspective, but we also offer solutions for customers on that same vein. If I can just say a little bit on resilience, you know, as we look at some of the core components that we want to, look at. First and foremost, you know, you need to start with a framework. And there are a number of frameworks out there. We've alluded to many of them already. NIST is a particularly common one that I like from an underwriting standpoint because it's very industry neutral and encompasses not only the cybersecurity elements, but also the recovery response mechanisms that, as we've all heard from my fellow panelists, are extremely important now. Establishing some key risk indicators to then measure against that framework is extremely important as well. And then analyzing the results of that to know how those key risk indicators are measuring up against your own firm's risk appetite when it comes to cyber, and then making adjustments. I think it's been said already, but I think it's important to emphasize that cybersecurity and cyber resilience, more importantly, is very much a circular journey. It's not a linear. It's not a destination. It's something that that all firms, Zurich included, have to look at, you know, from a continuum. And it's something that is continuing to evolve as technology changes and as the regulatory landscape changes. In terms of your question around the tools that we're looking at, again, you know, we look at our own resilience, but then we have to look at the resilience of our customers. And from an underwriting standpoint, one of the things that we are particularly looking at now is beyond just the cybersecurity elements, but now looking at that response and recovery piece, the redundancies, how quickly a firm can get back up and running. You know, if there's a manufacturing line that goes down because of a cyber incident, how quickly can that line get back up and running? Is there an alternative plant that can come online? And looking at those backups is extremely important from a resiliency standpoint and from an insurance standpoint to know how your business can keep operating. There are a number of tools that are out there now that are giving us as insurance companies some indicators on the health and the resiliency. But many of them only look at the security elements of it. And as we've all been saying, it's the security, of course, is one piece of that, but it's really the business continuity, the incident response plans that play such a critical role in building cyber resilience within an organization. And that's where the tools will continue to evolve over time, but where a lot of underwriting, the utilization of risk engineering teams, for example, is extremely important in looking at how firms are doing that, because it's not something that a tool can pick up on its own.
Yeah, okay. Art, as firms approach operational resilience, there obviously are, you know, overlaps, interactions with operational risk, with recovery and resolution, with cybersecurity, and there's a lot of words being used which are already defined in certain areas, but they might be used differently in, you know, in different areas. And I was wondering if you see a need for there to be definitions. Is there a definitional issue? And to what extent do you feel that the public sector or the private sector has a role there in trying to come to a coherent overview?
Well, Martin, you recall We had the first development of cyber. We said, well, we're talking past one another, and the FSB initiated a project to do a cyber lexicon. So that was an indication of the desired outcome that we need to achieve a common understanding of terms. As we broaden the landscape to include other operational resiliency issues, the same sort of, if you will, challenges do ensue. And in that regard, I'd be supportive of that type of initiative. Whether or not that's FSB or whether or not that's done through another means, I'm agnostic to, but the idea that we need to talk to each other, not past one another, and those are all that words do matter, and what we defined in those words is important. That is a fundamental premise of what we think we need to have done in the near term. I know organizations have suggested such a thing as a operational lexicon, and you've been part of the discussion, so I think you're aware of the need to do that. So I don't see any reason why we wouldn't. The questions come down to who should lead it, how do we do that? Because in the practical, I can tell you that cyber lexicon for FSB took the better part of a year. I mean, we don't have that kind of time in most cases that we're dealing with. So we have to leverage what is maybe the most appropriate definition that exists today and kind of put that into practice and reinforcing that. So practitioners that are sitting up here, I'm sure you have views on that, how to best do that. I don't want to introduce yet another set of terms, and so I'd be open to hearing what your preference is. I've heard NIST once, you know, I'm sure there's another taker there. I'm sure ISO will come up, but either way, we have to get our heads around what is the definitional parameter we want to put in here. What terms are most relevant, and how do we use those terms?
Yeah. And maybe as a follow-up question for Anne, there was a question from in terms of cultural clashes between different departments. So as you've brought together people from IT and security and risk management, and how do financial institutions deal with those cultural, challenges between different players in different departments?
Actually, it was a learning experience, right?
Yeah.
I mean, years ago, we did a transformation, so we were a little better off when we've established resilience risk, because about 3 years ago, we were one huge information security risk department. So we implemented the controls, we selected the technologies, we tested them, okay? We didn't think much about risk, but, we did our risk assessments for our applications and our third parties and that. So a few years ago, we actually took all of what we would call the true techies, and we put them in what's known as the first line. So we operate the 3 lines of defense model. So the first line are the control owners. They implement the tools. They manage the products. They do the assessments. Second line, of which I'm in, is information security risk. It's really an easy transition into going into something called resilience risk now. You still have information security. We're still worried about it, but we definitely oversee what the first line is doing. And some of my peers in the first line have recommended I go and work for like ART, because I do a really good job challenging them on what they're doing. Okay? And then your third line, obviously, is your audit. But for us, it was an easy transition because we had made that split.
If I can just comment there too, I think it's really great to hear actually that it was a fairly easy transition, but a journey, as you said. In underwriting these risks, I've been doing the underwriting of these risks for close to 20 years. When the first cyber products came, and we always only spoke to the IT group, and that was it. And that was the one team you spoke to, and in many cases, that was actually a very difficult conversation because IT was taken in isolation. It was taken as sort of a personal pride. I built the system. I built the security around it. It was a very difficult conversation, but now that the technology has evolved, and now that the risk has really evolved, the importance of bringing together different groups, whether it's risk management, IT, HR, there's a number of different functions that have to come into the discussion on
But
that.
what's more important is that the businesses are now understanding they own the risk.
Exactly.
That's right.
Okay, because in the past it was you had an IT organization, and the business said, "This is what I'd like," and they went and they developed the tool, they picked it, they put it in, and it was like, that's the business, right? Over the past few years, you've seen how the business really now, oh man, I own this. It's me. I've got to make sure I'm doing the right decisions, and I think that's been one of the biggest transformations and the eye-openers for the first line.
I think the fact that they own it and they understand that they are integrated into other parts of the organization, definitely the right way to go.
Yeah.
Right. And being a security nerd, I just want to touch on one thing. So we all talk about IT, but IT is entirely different than information security. It's a different mindset, different skill set. And I think that's the next evolution that has to come. We're already seeing it in pockets, but we really need to see it from, one's an investigative mindset and one's a build mindset. So really once we get to that point, I think we'll be further down the road.
Yeah. Marlena, from the survey results, is there anything that came out in terms of governance, in terms of how the are addressing this internally in ways
Yeah.
that you find that are interesting?
Yeah, so a couple of pieces, right? One is there is definitely a shift towards 3 lines of defense when you think about cyber risk. And so we see increasingly firms have set up, there is more of the execution IT organization, and then there's a second line oversight organization, which has, the review and challenge role in terms of risk identification, helping to set the risk tolerance, etc. So there's something about the roles and responsibilities being clearer and having a first versus a second line. That's one. I think the second has been, clearly it's been escalated or rather elevated, right, cyber as a board topic. And so we see a vast majority of firms discuss cyber with the board quarterly. Some actually have reported that they do it at every board meeting, right? I think the next stage of evolution is especially when I talk to my clients, right? Cyber is still discussed within the board's risk committee or the audit committee, as opposed to the entire board itself, right? And so it's making sure that we bring the awareness much more broader than just risk as well as audit. So that's the second point in terms of governance, right? The third point in terms of governance is, I think there's been a bigger shift towards it, and I think, Laurie, you alluded to this, right? Towards as an organization, how do we set up the right metrics, thresholds, tolerances, and use that as a way of governing ourselves, right? And I think where we would, at least I personally would like to see the evolution is, as we do that, to make sure we bring business into the discussion, right? Because at least from my perspective, right, what I've seen in terms of cyber is we started out, treating it a bit like a technology problem within IT. Over time, we grew it to say it's technology as well as risk, right? We need to make sure we truly business into the discussion, because that's when you can have the discussions around what is my tolerance, right? If I want a multi-factor authentication on an app, that would allow me to reduce risk in a particular way, but it does change my customer experience in a different way. And how am I making those trade-offs in that way, right? And I feel like the next evolution is actually having business help us make those trade-offs. And I think the risk function, the technology function should help them understand what the trade-offs actually are. But there's very much a customer user experience here that the business needs to be a part of.
Yeah. And as you look at your customers, right, your customers want to be 24/7 on all their devices, and they want all this new access. How do you view that balance internally in terms of trying to keep them safe, but also giving them the freedoms that they're asking for?
How you do that is you really look at it. Look, we're never, and I think, John, you said something earlier, right? You're never going to be 100% secure.
Right.
Right? And if you truly want to lock everything down, then you may as well shut the doors, close the windows, and just go home. Right? So what you really have to do is look at the tools that you're implementing and really think of okay, if I do this, now what?
Yeah.
And we tend to forget that, right? When you try to have an incident, you may say, oh, we can fix it, let's just put this in. Hang on a second. If you do that, now what can happen, right? Everybody's in a hurry to react without thinking about the next step. And before you know it, now you've done something and you've caused another problem. So I think you have to find that balance as to when you look at how to best service the external customers and even your internal ones, right? Find that balance between, doing the right thing and business running, keeping everything, but making sure that you've mitigated as much risk as possible. And there are some things that you have to go back and you may do something, but that's where you work with the business to understand, is it within their risk appetite? Is it within their tolerance levels? And that's really the study. That's where the time and effort goes into place, asking the right questions and making sure we're doing the right thing.
I'm sorry, go
No,
ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say that along those same lines, I think if we start moving more towards security by design, so we're talking about bringing the business units in as well as IT, but if there is a business function or a new technology you want to get out there, a new service, oftentimes what I've seen, and even when I was in industry, they would come and say, hey, we're doing this, and now go fix it. Well, it's too late. It's already been developed, right? So if we bring the team in, because it is a holistic approach, you solve pain points up front, and you have a more secure product on the back end, so it serves your customer experience better, so you don't have to go through those bumps and fixes once the customer started using it.
Yeah, and to pile on that, right? I think when you start having those multifunctional discussions, IT, security, risk, as well as business, you can also plan forward. So you can actually say, hey, I want to build this app, and I have to put in this amount of security. As I think about my communication to customers, let me explain to them why that's actually the case, right? And that's a business marketing function, but business wouldn't be able to do that if they didn't understand the reasons behind it, right? And so it's a little bit of how I think about airport security, right? So we've gotten to the point where we understand that airport security is necessary, and there's a little bit of hopefully awareness among us about why we actually do it. Now, there are also ways you can improve the user experience, obviously. That actually requires a discussion across the functions to say, how do I take into account user experience, the risk tolerance that we have, the protections that we actually want to put into place, and actually triage across them?
Yeah, at Zurich, we refer to that as the triangulation of cyber. So if you think of everything as sort of a triangle, you've got security, you've got efficiency, and then you've got cost that goes into that. And at some point in time, if you choose security, you might be sacrificing cost. And that could be financial cost, it could be opportunity cost as well. If you want efficiency, you might be sacrificing some security on that. The idea is that you want to try and have everything in balance as much as possible, but realize that at any given point in time, something is pulling on each of those elements, and you have to decide as an organization what your risk tolerance is. What's more important? Is cost more important? Is security more important? Or is efficiency and user experience more important? Again, try to keep everything in balance as much as possible, which is not easy to do.
Well, maybe more than a footnote on that is the customer experience was defined as kind of like you use an app. That may not be the only way to deliver that service. And so if a disruption occurs and the app's down, we still have other means, and most firms are factoring that in. So a little bit of let's be more pragmatic about it might be useful here. If we're spending billions of dollars on that app, and the security of it, but we don't have a good backup, if the app goes down, you're still not resilient, right? So the idea would be to have resiliency for that service, not just those particular applications. And I think that's, I said it was a little bit more than a footnote, but the idea that that app has to be there because that's the user experience. It does have a cost. There are trade-offs here. And if we're building secure systems and we have sustainability in mind, we want to be able to deliver that loan product, for example, irrespective. And I think you can do it over that. You can still go to a branch. You might be able to call up. There's so many other alternatives that the firm has to factor in. I think it'd be remiss to say, if the app's down, we're not resilient. Is the service still being provided? That's the point we have to get to.
I wanted to bring third parties into it. Obviously, a lot of the issues here are using critical third-party vendors, the cloud, for example, or other, vendors. I was wondering, what are you doing internally to feel comfortable about their resilience? How do you approach the use of your third-party vendors? You want to maybe start with that, or?
Sure. Do you mean in terms of how Zurich's managing third party, or how we use them for customers?
How you're managing the risk of the fact that they're doing critical services for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I don't think there's any question. Third parties and vendors and suppliers, I think, are a huge, they're a huge asset. Certainly for us on the insurance side, they also can be a huge risk as well. And if I look at some of the larger incidents that have taken place in cyber, many of them emanate out of third party and that supply chain, which is critically important. I think in terms of vendor management, we have a process internally that we go through to vet the security of any third party vendors that we are bringing on. We utilize a lot of third parties from an underwriting standpoint in helping us to try and assess critical either vulnerabilities or critical issues with any of our customers that are that are applying for insurance. So they play a really important role in the ecosystem, Alina, as you were saying, in terms of how we look at the risk. And I actually think kind of shifting that view a bit is critically important, because it is the third-party vendors that sometimes can be the weakest link from an internal perspective. As I said, from an external perspective and from an underwriting standpoint, they do play a really important role. In many cases, in some of the products that we are offering now, we integrate some of those third-party services and make them available to customers, particularly for customers that may not have the resources nor the expertise to have some of those those services built into their own ecosystem or their own security resilience. Examples such as security monitoring is one example of a service that that we integrate as part of our policy form, and we think that's extremely important in helping to identify claims before they happen. But in all cases, whether it's a vendor that we are looking at, again, for our own purposes, or that we're using for some of our customers, that analysis and that in-depth deep dive into their own security is extremely important and something that we do.
Yeah. Anne, is there a difference between how you approach smaller vendors, startups, fintechs, versus maybe more established financial market infrastructure?
No, we have a really good third-party methodology.
Yeah.
Similar to that, we have a whole third-party risk management team. We vet all of the third parties that we utilize. I mean, third parties, to me, they're a concern, right? They always will be. And I think the important thing is that when you start talking to the businesses, it's really letting them see their amalgamated third-party risk. How many third parties is a particular business line or function dependent on, right? Because these, when we talk to the senior executives, sure, they might do a one-off, right? But when you bring all of that together, it's like, what is that total amalgamated risk of how many third parties are you truly using to execute something that might be important to you? We do similar assessments, right, of third parties, and I'm actually dealing with some of my peers at the Fed right now because you have a lot of these financial market utility firms, right? We all use them. When you go knock on their door, they're not that receptive to letting you come in to look at their security. They're like, well, what are you going to do? You need us. So I've actually challenged the regulators on, well, what are you doing about it? And if you're looking at them, why aren't you sharing that information with all of the sector and letting us know how stable that particular financial utility is?
Right.
That's what we need to know.
So especially when it's a utility that serves many.
That serves many, exactly, because they are a true risk for all of the financial institutions.
Yeah, Art, how do you see all this?
Just respond to that. Thanks for teeing it up. Let's talk about the current state and future state. The current state is we have more point-in-time type examinations and assessment. But that's not going to be able to, that won't be sufficient in the future state. And we're actually already there now. So let's take the cloud providers as a point, okay? All of us use cloud for some parts of our operations, Fed inclusive. Now, in the environment that we find ourselves in, each one of us going individually into a cloud provider and assessing what their security framework may be or their resiliency may be is actually counterproductive. Right? It not only takes away time from them, but it doesn't give us the level of assurance because that's point in time. So the evolution of this, if we think it through, and the cloud providers, I understand, are thinking about this, it would be for them to assess what their resiliency is by some high level of standards, have that independently verified by some third party in real time, and have readouts to all of us that reflect that, not just one of us.
Right.
And the idea there is to actually elevate that expectation because it's not just the financial services sector, it's defense, it's health, it's energy. All those sectors have the same desire as we do to have that level of assurance on that. So why would it just be the financial services sector, and why would it be a group of regulators doing it, to be blunt with you? I think we need to elevate that to a level where the standards that we're being evaluated against in these firms is pretty clear.
Yeah.
The performance is verified by an independent third party, and that's done on a real-time basis. Point in time will not suffice. We all do the upfront assessment when we get them as a new provider. What happens day two, day three? That's the level of assurance we kind of need. The model to doing that is not the traditional one. We go in periodically and look at it. It has to be more real-time, and we may need to use different technologies to achieve that. It might be more AI-centric and the like. But the idea is that's where we need to go in order to do it.
But the only challenge I'd like to make to that is that I agree they could do their assessment, but when we talk about the independent third parties coming in, it's got to be someone they don't pay.
Right.
I mean, realistically, okay, we all see that, right? There are a lot of third parties that will come in, whether they're,
I'm open to it.
Hey,
different
The government doesn't
organizations,
get a
right?
bill
You'll
for
hire
that.
someone
Taking
to
my
come
business.
in, and realistically, you really truly want an independent coming in to look at that, to look at everything they've done and challenge it,
I don't agree.
right? Because the person who signs the check is the one who also gets to look at the articles and write up and say, well, I don't like the way you worded that. Could we soften that?
All right, so we can debate who should pay. All right? I think in essence you somewhat agree with it has to be a third
Yes,
party that we
agree.
can all rely on.
Agree.
It can't just be point in time as we've done historically.
Right.
Agree.
The pay thing, I'm still trying to work through.
So-
So we should talk through that.
the only other thing I would throw into the mix is the tool, right? So, we've talked about NIST, you mentioned ISO. those are point-in-time assessments and audits.
Yeah.
And they're also, one of the things, again, because my theme is always evolution, we have to get past this kind of checklist mentality of how, and because even on this, which is a great tool, but it's do you have an incident response plan? It's not how good is it.
Yep.
And I think that's the next step where we have to really go. If you want a true view into are your third-party folks, can you trust them? I did one not too long ago where I said, what's your incident response plan? It was to call you.
Yeah.
So that's not really what we're looking for.
And that's a really important point, because on the insurance side too, historically, as if you want to purchase an insurance policy, you fill out an application, and an application is typically yes/no questions. And if I go back 20 years, and even now, most of the questions are still yes/no. Do you have a firewall? Do you have a patch management process? Do you have an incident response plan? I can't think of many applications where we see those as a no. 20 years ago, there were a lot of no's.
Yeah.
Now most of them are yeses, but John, as you said, it's not really the yes/no. It's the shade of gray in between.
Yes, but.
It's what is your process? What is your patch management? What is your incident response plan? And all of those sub 100 questions in between that can be very difficult to ask on an application. So I do agree that is extremely important. That's where some of the tools I think will help, because it's very difficult to sit and do. I mean, you could spend 3 days with an IT, with a risk management team. I won't say IT, with a risk management team to glean some of those questions. But at the end of the day, it's still a point in time, and it's very much an evolutionary process.
Right.
Yeah,
Marlena?
and we're seeing, and to my comments earlier, right? We're seeing, as you see the ecosystem start to get larger, and there's a greater awareness that there's this third-party risk, right? On the one hand, of course, there is a great need or appetite on the part of financial services to do more evolutionary as opposed to point-in-time assessments. On the other hand, the trade-off is cost, right? There's a certain amount of cost, there's a certain amount of effort in there, and so interestingly, when we surveyed the firms about what are the kinds of sector-level collaborations you could do, third-party assessments actually rose to the top. I think, 55% or so of respondents said, oh, we would love to collaborate on third-party assessments. But there's a bit of a tension here for me personally, which is, yes, on the one hand, I understand why people want to do it. On the other hand, having been at the forefront to try and gather some of these utilities together, you start getting into the nitty-gritty of each firm wants a slightly different flavor of what that third-party assessment looks like. They want to be able to link it back to their internal processes, financial, risk management, business processes, etc., right? And so here's where I think the industry has a little bit of tension to actually get to, right? On the one hand, we all agree we want to reduce third-party risk and that there is a high cost to do that, so there is value in collaborating. On the other hand, to do that means we need to move towards a greater amount of industry standardization that we need to get ourselves and our firms actually really comfortable with.
Yeah. And it's also useful for the FMUs and for the other providers if they do like 80%, which is common, and maybe 20%, which is bespoke, and things like that. John, you talked in the beginning about sovereign attacks and about ransomware, and I was wondering to what extent are the dangers on the third-party side, and to what extent are they, the firms themselves that are being attacked that are in scope?
I would say as time progresses, we're actually, again, everything's a blend. We're starting to see more of that because everybody is so reliant on third party and vendors. Sometimes it's hard to tell where does the core business stop and where does the vendor begin. We've seen a number of large scale, kind of public things that have come up recently from third party relationships. And one of the things that I see particularly is in the response world is the contractual obligations. So that we outsource our risk. We think we are. We're really not. But a lot of the firms that I deal with think that, now I've pushed it over to these folks and they will take care of it. Hands off, right? And then when there is an incident, they go back and it turns out the things that they thought were contractually obligated were not either being performed or really weren't in the contract and were not enforceable. So when I talk about ransomware, for example, can't tell you how many times people say, well, our backups are handled by such and such firm, and you go to them and say, well, where are your backups? We back up every 6 months or so. Or our backups roll over so frequently that they're not of use. So it really is it's both inside and outside, looking at what is the process. And I think it kind of gets back to a comment about when we evaluate third party, if it's a checklist, and they say, yes, we do provide that, yes, we have it, then you don't have a good, firm idea of it.
And to what extent are there obstacles to sharing this sort of information across borders for these third parties? I mean, is that
Well, that
also a problem?
definitely, and as increased regulation comes along, you know, and it's kind of weird. Again, everything's evolutionary. In the old days, it was wild, wild west, and everybody did whatever they wanted. Right. And now, as you know, we're starting to mature and regulations coming in, I think we run a bit of a risk of stovepiping or siloing some of the information sharing. And I think the next step is, as we're pushing across, is how do we share that across the various groups, you know, whether it be, you know, DFS, GDPR, CCA, you know, again, how do we homogenize all of these so we can all have that conversation? Yep. I know you were going to jump in there at me.
Well, since you mentioned regulation, I can. Yeah, totally agree with what you said. We don't want fragmentation in this regard. We often consider that to be a very negative part of regulation, so having a common approach makes sense. The sharing of information about that, though, does have that trusted party element that we have to figure out, to be quite frank with you. Does everybody need to get that information? Only certain parties. So we need to work through that on a practical level. Anyone who contracts with the firm should get it. But if I'm a firm who may want to use that third party, do I get access to that as part of the due diligence going into that relationship, and what conditions and the like? So I think that's one of the things we do need to work through, but can't disagree at all about the propensity for regulation to kind of fragment as we
Yeah, it's particularly on a global scale as well, because you know many of our clients have customers that are all over the world, and many of these laws now are governing privacy of the citizens, not just where the company is domiciled. And you know, if you think about a large retailer or a large technology company, I mean, they've got customers all over the world, and so now you've got to comply with not only U.S. regulations, which are constantly changing, but you've also got the GDPR, you've got the LGPD in Brazil, you've got numerous other laws that are coming into effect, and they're all a bit different in terms of what they protect, what the requirements are for notification, what the contractual requirements are. So yes, I agree. The fragmentation is challenging, and not only domestically, but internationally as well.
Yeah, so, go ahead. I'm going to say, so with the fragmentation, I think, and I'm going to lead into this profile here.
Right, yeah.
I think this is something that was really key across the FIs in the U.S., and I know we've been having many conversations with our global regulators as well as our global peers. So within the U.S., it's been going on for about 2 years. We worked with the trade agency to develop what we call the financial sector profile for cybersecurity self-assessments. All right, and the key thing to me, and I think being in the second line role, is checkbox mentality never works. Right. And it really comes down to the operational effectiveness. So, you know, when you hear the term sector profile, it is really something that we would love to see organizations start to embrace. Yeah. Why? Because it is a consistent framework using consistent vocabulary. And what we've actually done now is we recently, HSBC in the U.S., we completed our first round of the profile this year. It was used in a ongoing supervisory exam by the OCC. So while they didn't look at all categories of it, they did focus on a couple, and they like it. Yeah. Okay. But and they came back with some queries, which we've taken back to the industry to address. Additionally, we drafted a user guide. Right, so we put together for the 277 statements in there. It's like, what are the types of things that should be in your response? What does good evidence look like? And why is that? It's to drive consistency. And we're pushing that out. I've given it to Deutsche in Europe. I've given it to Citi in Europe. I've given it to Citi locally. We're now working with the trade agency on updating it, getting feedback from around the world as to how to that user guide. The benefit of that is that really any regulator that comes into the organization, they should know what to expect when they do an assessment of your cybersecurity framework. For the industry, it's you should have something now that's like a guidebook is how do you complete that framework. The one message that I would give is that to me it's really important that if anybody uses the framework, it has to withstand the due diligence of all 3 lines of defense. Yeah. You know, having the first line completed, yeah, great. You know, we all know it's going to be, yeah, we got that. Oh, yeah, I have that. Oh, I implemented that. When you start getting the evidence from them and you say, great, so you implemented the package on your hardware. Did you turn it on? No. Oh, you turned it on. Great. Is anybody looking at it? Nobody's looking at it? Well, then you're not You don't have it, so just don't try to make it look nice because you do. So really, the profile, it's a good tool.
Yeah.
It's in its infancy. Many organizations in the U.S. are using it. I've got, within HSBC, we're planning global rollout to hopefully begin in 2020, but it'll be a phased rollout. And I think it's just something that all regulators should really just take a step back. And this is really HKMA, this is Singapore, this is the PRA, it's everyone, to really take a good look at it. And while you may not get 100% of what you want, when you look at it, because it's based on NIST and so many other different standards, any regulator should get about 80% of what they need. Then you come back and you ask those additional questions.
Yeah.
And then you keep fine-tuning the profile, right?
Yeah, the good thing about the profile, as you say, is that it's based on a NIST, and internationalizing it, working with BPI, working with other trades together, and bringing in, European rules, Asian rules, so that firms really have a spreadsheet to show exactly where they are matching. Are you noticing the same sort of? Yes, please go ahead, Art.
We don't actually do endorsements from the regulatory side, but in regards to the profile, it does capture what we were looking for. We talked a lot about how we can do this consistently across firms, what level of evidence is in there. It ties to each one of the jurisdictional requirements that's up there in NIST and others as well. So I thought it was a very good thing, and we support it. I don't know if regulators don't go on the record of supporting many things, but today I'm going to say I support the profile and the approach. It's a good start, gives us the evidence that we need, and we can always ask additional questions. So I just wanted to commend the industry for working on that and holding us in the process.
And are you also noticing that foreign jurisdictions are starting to think more in terms of trying to avoid fragmentation, or do you just see that it's getting worse?
I'm saying that they want to avoid it.
Yeah.
I think it's really when we all work together, whether it's the sector, whether it's the regulators, we really do need to work together if we're all going to survive this new world.
Yeah.
Right? We have to. We can't work in silos. That just doesn't work anymore. All right. I think we see that it has to be. You have to work together. And this is where you join up with your regulators. I'm fortunate, or some might call it a misfortune. My regulators used to sit on the same floor that I did. So lovely, right? But I mean, we have very transparent relationships. We have regular calls. We touch base, formally once a month, but my phone can ring 6-7 times a week. It's the regulator just calling, asking, or I can call them to say, hey, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? And you have that two-way conversation, which is important because we're both after the same thing, right? We're both trying to protect our businesses. We're trying to protect our customers. So why not use each other?
Lori, I wanted to ask you also about cyber risk insurance. It's the fastest growing part of the global insurance market. It maybe comes from a small base, but because of a GDPR and because of other regulations, it's definitely growing very quickly. How is the product evolving, and to what extent is it including things now, including protection for the clients?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, for as much as cyber risk is evolving, and as I said earlier, these products, dedicated cyber products, have really been out in the industry for only about 20 years, which for some it seems like a long time to me. I know in the insurance term, in the insurance world, it's not a long time, really. The core product itself, in terms of first and third party insuring agreements, the core product itself over that 20-ish year period really hasn't changed that much. There have been some tweaks, there have been some extensions, there have been some modifications to account for regulatory changes, to account for Internet of Things, but the actual product itself really has remained fairly well, I'd say, intact from where it started 2 decades ago. What has changed is really two things. One is the driver and what really prompts customers to buy it. When the products were first launched, it was right on the heels of California SB 1386, which was the first data breach notification law in the US. And so everything was really about third-party liability and data breach and the loss of financial information. It's been said a couple times that financial institutions were some of the early adopters of these policies, and that continues to very much be true. With GDPR coming into effect a few years ago, or a year ago, but talk of it coming a few years ago, and particularly as it made its way across Europe, first-party coverages were really more of the driver, particularly as there's more automation in systems, and industries that didn't previously look at or think of themselves as data risks, now all of a sudden we're looking at the first-party elements. So the drivers of demand have changed a bit, but the overall core policies, again, there's been some evolution of them over time, but the core insuring agreements really have remained fairly well intact. So as I said, one of the changes really has been the drivers of demand. The other one has really been the integration of services.
Yeah.
And I've already alluded to this as well, that now in addition to offering a core product, that in many cases there are some services that are embedded into the policy. One of the older ones has always been the post-breach incident response. So in the event that a firm or a company faces a cyber incident, that there are support services in place to help with crisis management, with forensics, with public relations. So all of the elements of sort of that immediate first response that needs to go into notifying customers, notifying regulatory agencies. So some of those services have been built into policies, and now more recently, pre-breach services. So this idea of don't wait for something to happen to you. It's not a matter of when. So start being a bit more proactive now and focus on improving cybersecurity, focus on building and improving your business continuity plan, so that if or when an incident actually does happen, that those processes are improved upon. And insurance carriers are investing quite a bit in this space to, again, not just focus on offering a product and paying a claim, but really helping customers become more cyber resilient. And we believe that by integrating some of these services, particularly the pre-breach services, into an insurance policy, that does help our customers move forward in that direction.
Yeah, and it creates a public good also, because if your customers get healthier and more resilient, that impacts the whole sector. Marlena, from the survey, we also had a few questions on use of cyber risk insurance. What are they using it for? Where are they heading with it? What did you find there?
In general, it feels like, and I think this is exactly what you're saying, right, Laurie? There is an increased awareness and use of cyber insurance. That's number one. Number two, interestingly, we didn't find a correlation between the size of the organization and the size of the policies. Now, to be clear, of course, people don't always want to disclose their policies, so we're talking about a small sample size, right? And so your point about what are the drivers of not just the use of a policy, but also the size of the policy, I think it's actually something very interesting to talk about as a firm, right? Outside of the survey, I'd have to say in my discussions with clients, I've increasingly heard discussions about cyber risk insurance, right? So I feel like 4 years ago, rarely would I have a cyber conversation where people brought up the use of insurance. Now we're talking about insurance both for post as well as pre-breach. I think secondly, I'm increasingly hearing boards asking questions about that. What does our insurance policy look like? What are the requirements, based on the insurance policy, right? And so I think increasingly as we think about, going back to our conversation about awareness of cyber risk, the risk tolerance, and as you start shifting towards what are the mitigating ways to be able to manage down the risk, insurance is becoming a very important lever here. Right. Some of it, I suspect, and this is also the things that we ask us in the survey, right, is the plethora of data over time to be able to, quote unquote, size the risk, or sort of size how is it that the risk is actually happening, so that you can hopefully protect yourself against it, right? So as we move into more of the automation landscape, as we get more of the information, then we can say, here are the pieces that we want ourselves against, and here's what we're willing to pay for that insurance.
Right, and this is where something like a common, a cyber lexicon, for example, Art, I think becomes particularly helpful for us in the insurance space, because as you look at from one carrier to the next, we all might cover very similar things, but we're using very different terminology and how we're describing it. And as a customer, and I'm thinking as you look at the various products, it must be very challenging. It's challenging for us on the insurance side as we're looking at building towers of insurance, but as a customer, to understand what the differences are in certain definitions or certain provisions within the policy can be very challenging. And I know we have talked quite a bit about, sort of having this common terminology, this common phrasing, so that when we say a security incident or we say a privacy breach, that there's a common understanding of what exactly that means and how it's defined. We're still a ways off from that, but I think there are some real benefits to looking at that.
Yeah, we were very supportive of the FSB's cyber lexicon work, which was published last year, and we've encouraged them to regularly update it if possible, and so it's very helpful too. On one challenge for everybody has been the lack of historical data, both because people don't always want to share if they're breached, and because cyber incidents have risen so sharply over time in sophistication, in scope, in size. To what extent is there a need? Is there a need for a third party or for some sort of a utility that collects somehow this information? Because that would help with underwriting, that would help with a defense. To what extent do people here think that that would be helpful? To have a repository of anonymous attacks.
I think it's a great idea. I think it's very difficult to implement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to say that. I think it'd be ideal to have the amount of data, right? The issues with it is you'd have to collect quite a significant amount of detail about the drivers of the incident itself to actually make it usable. That's one. The second is the nature of cyber risk, to you know, John's point earlier, right? Evolves so quickly. And so relying on historical data, I mean, I think we have this problem in operational risk generally, but cyber, I think, amplifies this issue of, you know, the ability, when you look back, it doesn't really tell you very much about the future, right? And so I think increasingly, and at least when I think about the broader nature of operational risk, I think increasingly business and risk are realizing you can't data and metrics against it, also sort of data and analytics against it, but you need to turn it into discussions about stories and scenarios, which then goes back to our point about, are we protecting the right things? Are we having the discussions about the things that we care about the most, right? And I feel like that's an evolution that we're getting to even in operational risk management.
Yeah, we always say there's no two cyber claims that are exactly alike, and so Melanie, you're exactly right that it's very because insurance historically looks at previous claims in order to drive predictions in the future. And cyber, it's very difficult to do that because no two claims are exactly alike. Now, having said that, I think there are some benefits to a common repository because we only have as much information as we have about perhaps our customers or what we can gather from third parties. But imagine if you could amplify that by 10, how much more information we could have, how much more, how many better we might be able to drive, better data, refining underwriting, refining pricing and capacity. There are a lot of benefits to doing that, but but anonymizing it, I think, is always a challenge because everyone says, or a lot of people will say, yes, that's a really great idea, but nobody wants to give up their information. No one wants to be the first one to put that out. Exactly. You go first, and then I'll put mine in. But anonymizing that data becomes very challenging, and particularly if we're all using different terminology, it does become very difficult in aggregating that. But I do think there are some benefits to doing that. It's just a matter, as you said, of how you implement it.
And I'm wondering, from your point of view, the information sharing committees like the FSISAC, I mean, I think that's a good venue for that. And they're actually, you know, very beneficial, and they're across a number of industries. That may be a place for that for an informal, as opposed to, hey, we're all piling our data in here, and everybody has to share it. Do you guys find the ISAC to be helpful in that regard?
It's useful as a source of information sharing.
Right.
As to this data repository, a couple of questions come to mind are, what are we going to use it for? So if it's most of the fears of regulated institutions, it might be used as a law enforcement tool, right? So if it's designed for that, it has a different outcome. If it's a learning tool, how an exploit was done, whether or not it was something we can learn from, I think that does have some benefits that we could actually get out of it. But it comes back to being clear on how it might be used. I think that's one of the issues.
Yeah, and you have to have a critical mass too. I think, you know, in order to do that, you've got to have a majority or a vast majority of participants that are willing to put information into it. If you only have a small group of individuals, it's not going to yield the same result as it would if it's a full industry view, for example.
But it's the speed to updating it, right? Because so many changes come in from a technology perspective, and the bad guys are out there, and they're always one step ahead of us. So, you know, we can load all this data, and we're like, yeah, we know how they did that. Whoops, forget that, because they're already doing this now, all right? So that's a concern.
And to your point on that, and going back to ransomware, because it's the bane of my existence, you know, in the old days, it came in through phishing attacks. And by the way, when we talk about trends, the one thing that has not changed is phishing. Please don't click on email, ever. But, you know, ransomware used to come via phishing. Now it's actually mostly coming through RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. But a lot of people still think of it as coming through phishing because it's changing so rapidly in the reporting of it.
We had a question on ransomware, by the way. Traditionally, ransomware, if you look at the Bangladesh bank heist and things like that, has been in fiat currencies, and you know, increasingly it's been in Bitcoin and in other cryptocurrencies. To what extent is that relevant in terms of how law enforcement can stop that? I mean, can law enforcement stop that more difficultly?
Part of it, the use of Bitcoin digital currency does make it harder investigatively to determine because it's anonymous, right, with the blockchain. It's not like we can track a bank account and where it went, which obviously makes it more difficult. And the fact that it's tied to Bitcoin, we also see peaks and valleys depending on the Bitcoin market as to how, when the ransomware comes. So it absolutely impacts it. And then, of course, the piece of that is where did it originate from?
Yeah.
If it came from certain parts of the world that are less law enforcement cooperative or less cooperative with Western law enforcement. I was stationed in Central Europe for a number of years, and that was the difficulty. So that's the other piece of it. I don't know that it's necessarily just digital currency, but I think digital currency is a factor.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we've actually run out of time because our next panel is ready. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a great discussion.